The mud and the myth.
It is time to
Close
turn
your
on the
eyes and
lights.
picture the Middle Ages.
The truth
Go on,
about the
do
soul.
it.
Close your
What do
eyes
you
and
see?
picture the Middle
If you are
Ages.
like most
Go
people,
on,
you are
do
probably
it.
picturing a world entirely devoid of color. A landscape of perpetual rain where everyone is covered in a thick layer of mud, dying of the plague at the ripe old age of 25. A time when humanity collectively forgot how to read, write, or bathe, and spent 1,000 years waiting for the Renaissance to turn the lights back on. We call it the Dark Ages. It's a catchy name. It conjures images of ignorance, barbarism, and a total collapse of civilization. But there's just one tiny problem with this term. It is a lie. A marketing campaign invented by a grumpy Italian poet who was, frankly, a bit of a snob. Because if the Dark Ages were so dark, how did they build cathedrals that touched the clouds without a single computer? How did they invent the university, the mechanical clock and eyeglasses? Why was it the era that gave birth to the very foundations of modern Europe? Today on Cobblestone Secrets, we are putting the history books on trial. We're going to find out why one man's ego condemned 1,000 years of history to the shadows. It is time to turn on the lights. This is the truth about the so-called Dark Ages. The man who invented the dark. To understand the crime, we must first identify the culprit. Ladies and gentlemen, meet Francesco Petrarca, known to his friends as Petrarch. Born in 1304, Petrarch was an Italian scholar, a poet, and arguably the world's first hipster. Petrarch had a problem. He was living in the 14th century, but in his head he was living in ancient Rome. He was obsessed with the classical past. He spent his days wandering the ruins of Rome, looking at the crumbling marble columns of the empire, and then looking at the squabbling city-states of his own time and thinking, look at this mess, we used to be cool. In the year 1343, Petrarch wrote his epic poem, Africa. In it, he famously complained about his own era. He wrote, "My fate is to live among varied and confusing storms. When the darkness has been dispersed, our descendants can come again in the former pure radiance." Did you catch that? Darkness versus pure radiance. Petrarch decided that history was a sandwich. The top slice of bread was ancient Rome, glorious, civilized, perfect. The bottom slice, which he hoped was starting in his own time, was a return to that glory. And the filling, that thick 1,000-year slab of meat in the middle, that was the Dark Age, a period of tenebrae. Petrarch wasn't just observing history, he was engaging in virtue signaling. By calling his ancestors idiots, he was implying that he was the one smart enough to realize it. He was effectively saying, I am not like other medieval guys. I read Cicero. But here is the irony. Petrarch was standing on the shoulders of giants he refused to acknowledge. He claimed the world had been asleep since the fall of Rome. But while Petrarch was whining about the darkness, the medieval world had been busy inventing the very future he was enjoying. The Carolingian light. Let's rewind 500 years before Petrarch to the 8th century. If Petrarch was right, this should be the pitch-black center of the Dark Ages. Enter Charlemagne, king of the Franks, emperor of the Romans, and a man with a beard so magnificent it deserved its own postcode. Charlemagne realized that you can't run an empire if your administrators can't read. So he didn't sit around moping about the past. He launched what historians now call the Carolingian Renaissance. He recruited the smartest man in Europe, Alcuin of York, an Englishman, I might add, to overhaul the education system. They didn't burn books, they hunted them down. Monasteries across Europe became factories of knowledge. In fact, 90% of the ancient Roman literature that we have today, the very books Petrarch loved so much, only survived because Dark Age monks spent centuries painstakingly copying them out by hand. They even invented a new font, Carolingian minuscule. Before this, writing was a messy block of capital letters that looked like a toddler screaming in text form. The monks introduced lowercase letters, spaces between words, and punctuation. So the next time you send a text message that is actually readable, thank a Dark Age monk. If it wasn't for them, Petrarch wouldn't have had any Roman books to read in the first place. The invention of the university. Petrarch claimed his era was one of ignorance, yet the institution that defines higher learning today is a purely medieval invention, the university. In ancient Greece, you learned by following an old man in a toga around a garden. In the Dark Ages, they formalized education. By the year 1200, Europe was dotted with universities. These weren't just Bible study groups, they were studying geometry, astronomy, music, arithmetic, logic, and law. This was the era of scholasticism, a method of critical thought that dominated teaching. Men like Thomas Aquinas weren't blindly accepting faith, they were using Aristotelian logic to try and prove the existence of God. You might disagree with their conclusions, but you cannot deny their intellectual rigor. At Oxford, Robert Grosseteste was laying the groundwork for the scientific method, experimenting with lenses and light. Without these ignorant medieval scholars, Isaac Newton would have had nothing to stand on. The Gothic miracle. If you want physical proof that Petrarch was lying, you only need to look up. Roman architecture was impressive, yes, thick walls, round arches, very sturdy. But in the 12th century, medieval architects decided that sturdy was boring. They wanted to build with light. They invented the flying buttress. This engineering miracle allowed them to tear down the heavy walls and replace them with massive windows of stained glass. Think about the mathematics required to do this. There were no CAD programs, no calculators, just geometry and genius. They built stone skeletons that soared hundreds of feet into the air, defying gravity. When a peasant walked into a Gothic cathedral in the year 1250, they weren't walking into a dark place, they were walking into a multicolored light show, a kaleidoscope of glass that told stories in a way the Romans never dreamed of. Does this look like the work of a civilization in decline? Or does it look like a society reaching for the heavens? But perhaps you don't care about cathedrals or dusty books. You care about technology. Surely the Romans had better tech. They had aqueducts. Well, the medievals had something better. They had spectacles. Sometime around 1286, in Italy, a craftsman figured out how to grind glass lenses to correct vision. Before this, if you got old and went blind, your career was over. The Dark Ages gave humanity the gift of sight. And they gave us time. The Romans tracked time with sundials, useless in England, let's be honest, or water clocks which froze in winter. In the 13th century, medieval engineers invented the mechanical clock, the escapement mechanism. For the first time in human history, time wasn't something natural that flowed with the sun. It was a machine. It could be measured, divided, and sold. This invention literally synchronized the world. The heavy plow revolutionized farming, doubling the food supply and causing a population boom. The stern-mounted rudder allowed ships to sail the open oceans, paving the way for the age of discovery. The blast furnace allowed for the mass production of cast iron. Petrarch sat in his room writing poems with a quill, wearing glasses he probably didn't realize were a modern invention, checking the time on a mechanical clock tower outside, all while complaining that no one had invented anything since Caesar died. The irony is palpable, the grain of truth. Now, to be fair to our friend Petrarch, we must admit there is a grain of truth in his grumpiness. The early medieval period, immediately following the fall of Rome in 476 AD, was chaotic. Trade networks collapsed. You couldn't buy pottery from North Africa in London anymore. The grand stone villas of the Romans were abandoned because the central heating systems broke down and no one knew how to fix them. There was violence, Viking raids, Magyar invasions, local warlords. Life was dangerous, but dangerous is not the same as stupid. When the Roman state collapsed, society didn't just stop, it transformed. It moved from a centralized empire to a local feudal system. It was a survival strategy, and out of that survival mode came a new kind of vitality. It was a time of political experimentation. The Magna Carta in 1215 planted the seeds of modern democracy and human rights, concepts that would have been alien to a Roman emperor who ruled by divine fiat. Conclusion: the Renaissance of the mind. So why do we still use the term Dark Ages? Because it is a convenient story. It tells us that we are the moderns, the enlightened ones, and those people back then were just dirty peasants. It makes us feel superior. The Renaissance scholars, followed by the Enlightenment thinkers of the 18th century and the Victorians of the 19th, all had a vested interest in painting the Middle Ages as black as possible to make their own achievements shine brighter. But the reality is that history is not a light switch. It doesn't turn off for 1,000 years and then flicker back on. It is a river. The Middle Ages were a time of profound creativity, deep spirituality, and remarkable ingenuity. They didn't just preserve the past, they built the future. They forged the nations of Europe. They created the languages we speak today. They built the institutions we study in. Petrarch was wrong. The age he lived in wasn't dark. He just refused to open his eyes to the light that was all around him. The next time someone tells you something is medieval as an insult, just remember they are talking about the era that gave you your glasses, your university degree, and the clock on your phone. Thanks for watching this deep dive on Cobblestone secrets. If you want to uncover more lies about history, click on this video here about the real Braveheart, or this one about the horrors of the Victorian workhouse. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell. See you in the shadows.